Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for coming. We have a very special presentation today because I want to talk about something called the Planetary Health Film Lab. One of the partners of the Film Lab, of course, is the Planetary Health Alliance, as you can see by the logo up there. And the picture that you're looking at are the recent participants of the Planetary Health Film Lab 2022, what we call the Ecuador edition. So what we usually do, it's also a research project out of York University in Toronto, Canada. And it's housed in a research institute called the Daudelet Institute for Global Health Research. And what we do basically is we work with Indigenous communities around the world in different countries, particularly those that are situated in remote locations. And we teach the young people who sign up for the program to make documentary films in a certain style and standard that the United Nations has come to expect. And we get them to tell stories in their own way about planetary health issues that impact on their communities. So what you're seeing in this picture here are the recent graduates of the program that we held this summer. And we had 16 young Indigenous filmmakers from 11 different communities across the country of Ecuador. Okay, so today's presentation is going to dive deep into what the program is in general and what we did specifically this year. So a little bit of background. The Planetary Health Film Lab, now in its third year, is a research project co-led by James Orbinski, Kate Tilachek, who happens to be with us today, Deborah McDonald, and myself. In the months of May to August, filmmaking training sessions via Zoom are provided, and participants begin to collect interview footage and B-roll for their films. So what happens is I don't fly down to Ecuador right away and meet with them in person. We talk via Zoom and give them the instructions on how to use the equipment that they are provided with so that they have an understanding of how to use basic film equipment to start. Once they have the basic knowledge, we give them more specific instructions on how to shoot, who to interview, and how to ask interview questions. So the participants produce a documentary short film profiling planetary health issues in their community. So that's kind of the theme, the general theme they have to work with. So the week-long workshop, when we get around to doing it around August, educates participants in many different areas, not just filmmaking, but in the areas of planetary health, global environmental policy participation with the United Nations, professional documentary filmmaking, youth empowerment, digital storytelling, and land-based solutions in Indigenous communities. Now this last one is very important because as we discover the solutions that they put in place from their own experiences, these solutions are then shared with other communities so that they have a kind of an understanding in case they have a similar issue that they're dealing with. So this knowledge sharing really helps them come up with solutions they might not have come up with on their own. So more on the background. Each film produced in the program is submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for consideration to be added to the Youth Climate Report. And that's a digital database of videos produced by the global community of youth. And right now the database has 675 videos representing all 7 continents. Yes, even Antarctica. As I said, the database has close to 700 films, and those added this year will be represented at the COP27 Climate Summit in November in Egypt. The Planetary Health Film Lab was originally funded by a grant from the Canadian government's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and is now supported by the Hunter Family Foundation. And there they are again. This is just the day before they got their certificates. So this year we had 16 Indigenous youth from 11 communities across Ecuador. The films were made in the native languages of Quechua and Shuar, as 2022 marks the first year in the UN's International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Now, this is very important because that's going to be a focus of the UN Climate Summit this year. They want to see and hear as many Indigenous languages as possible and document them in an archive, because a lot of these languages are slipping, they're disappearing, they're not being widely spread. But having an international forum like the United Nations is a good way of spreading the words, literally, and also to preserve them as well. These ancient languages are Incan in origin and are rarely spoken outside of only a few West Coast countries in South America. Shuar in particular is restricted to the communities that live within the Amazon, and Quechua kind of spreads out a little more throughout the West Coast of South America. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the workshop now. With local partners, we had some local partners, of course. We can't do this all by ourselves from Canada. The local partners we had were the Escuela Politécnica Nacional University and the Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador and the Quechua Academy of Humanities. And in case you're wondering why Quechua is spelled differently from Quechua, Quechua is the Spanish word for Quechua. Okay? So we were able to secure camera equipment, including drones, and a post-production suite complete with 26 professional iMacs, valued at $10,000 each, and a selection of editing video software ranging from Apple's iMovie to Adobe Premiere Pro. Now, I don't expect you to know what that really means, but one is a very low-end editing system, and another is a very high-end professional system. And we had lots of choices in between as well. So whatever they gravitated towards and whatever they felt most comfortable with was the software we let them use. The first 2 days of the workshop featured presentations in English and translated into Spanish and Quechua, and were presented both in person and via Zoom in this production lab. The English language speakers for the first 2 days were myself, speaking about documentary filmmaking and digital storytelling. Charles Hopkins from Canada. He's the UNESCO Chair for Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability, and he spoke about youth engagement with the United Nations. Gigi Staffney, who happens to be here today. There's Gigi. Say hi, Gigi. Yeah, very good. She's from the USA, and she spoke about plant-based solutions for planetary health. This particular presentation resonated very well with them because that's what they do themselves. So it was very interesting for them to hear what was being done in North America compared to what they do at home in South America. Carter Kirilenko from South Africa, who spoke about impact producing for Indigenous communities. This is a special mode of documentary filmmaking that's aimed at yielding impact based on the social issue being profiled. And Carter Kirilenko is a specialist in this sort of mode of documentary filmmaking, specifically for Indigenous communities. And Jim Stinson from Canada, who talked about decolonizing planetary health. So those were the English speakers that we had. Oh, and one more. Debbie McDonald and Pablo Macias from Spain, and they spoke about youth empowerment. So this was the last speaker, of course, Pablo. He delivered his address in Spanish, which was a nice transition from the English to the next day where we had Spanish presentations. So days 3 and 4 of the workshop, all the presentations were held in person at the EPN lecture hall. That's the Escuela Politécnica Nacional University. And there's a picture of them there. That's my laptop with the poster for the film lab, and behind were the participants sitting in the lecture hall. The 3-hour sessions ran from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. each day, and translation services again were provided from Spanish to Quechua and Shuar. so that the participants could engage in discussions with the speakers. Participation for all 4 days of the presentations was 100%, so they were quite engaged with this. So here are the speakers that we had. We had Yaku Perez, Environmental Law and Indigenous Rights. He also happens to have run for president. He was a presidential candidate for Ecuador that particular year. He didn't win, of course, so he was available to speak with us. And there he is there. And then we had Zenaida Yasakama, and she spoke about environmental issues with indigenous territories. And there she is there. And then we had Arari Ruiz, who is the director of the Quechua Academy for Humanities I mentioned before. And he spoke about environmental politics, and there's Arari there. And then we had Julio Uquilema, and he spoke about economic impacts of planetary health issues, how money is impacted, and how poverty often results because of this. It's a very interesting talk. And then we had Sofia Luzuriaga. She's a professor at the Catholic Polytechnica University, and she spoke about environmental history in Ecuador. And there she is there. So we had a good selection of speakers on different topics, and this really kind of rounded out the first day of presentations that we had in English. Okay, so now the production schedule. So it began, as I mentioned earlier, in May this year. Participants began experimenting with camera equipment, shooting 1-minute videos of themselves and landscapes. So this was a very simple assignment. They would just film themselves because they're all used to taking selfies with their phones, right? And so they would do a little video of themselves talking, and then they would shoot some landscapes, like beautiful hills or a tree or a lake or something like that, just so they would get customized to working with natural daylight and long-range focus and some of these more technical things in filmmaking. In June, the participants attended a series of Zoom training sessions specific to documentary film production, and that's what I led. So I was able to tell them not only how to do documentary storytelling in short form, but also to share with them the standards and expectations of the United Nations when it comes to these films. In July, the participants arranged for interviews with elders in their communities, as well as those most impacted by the changes in their environment, climate, and land. Some participants researched experts in these fields from outside their communities and arranged for Zoom interviews with them. This is one of the good things to come out of the pandemic, eh? We were introduced to this Zoom technology, so you could actually not only talk to anybody anywhere in the world, but it was kind of considered a normal, regular, expected thing to do. It also really helped in securing interview footage of people that you would love to have in your film, but you couldn't afford to go and shoot them the old-fashioned way. So you could just do a Zoom call, hit record, and all of a sudden you got an interview you can insert into your film. Further on in July, participants created shot lists based on interview transcripts and went to locations to shoot these on the list. So just so you know, a shot list is a list of shots that you want to get that you don't have yet. And the things that you list are things that the person you interviewed mentioned in the interview. So if they said, we went down to the river and we looked at some rocks and we noticed there was a change in color, well, there's 3 shots that you have, right? You have going to the river, you have the rocks, and then you have the rocks of different color. So these become the 3 things on your shot list. And of course, once you have these shots, you insert them over the interview footage. So you keep the voice intact, so whenever they say river, you insert the shot of the river, and so on, right? In August, participants brought their footage to Quito, the capital of Ecuador, traveling by bus from across the country. Some of them traveled by bus for up to 4 hours. So they were very committed to this project. They checked into their hotel Sunday, August the 14th, and began the workshop the very next day. August 14th to 18th. Following daily presentations in the mornings, participants edited their films in the afternoon under my supervision until about 8 o'clock every evening. So they started the day at 8 o'clock and they ended at 8 o'clock, and they didn't mind doing that at all. On August 19th, we had something we call the Microfilm Festival, and that's held in Ecuador after the workshop is over, representing the first public exhibition of the participants' films. They answered questions from the audience and were given certificates of completion. So they had the complete filmmaking experience, right? Not only did they make a film, but they got to exhibit it at a film festival in front of the general public and media. And they got to answer questions just like filmmakers do after they premiere their films. And they got certificates of completion that they all held up. That was the first picture that I showed you. In September, participants produced Spanish transcriptions of their films, and they worked with the CEC Language Center at EPN University to translate their films into English. This is very important because the languages of Quechua and Shuar, as I mentioned before, are kind of rare. And so there's not a big audience for people that would understand those languages. So they need to translate them into Spanish and English. Spanish for the rest of South America, but also English for the United Nations. In October, once the English versions of the films were available, they are presented to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for approval. And once approved, they are added to the Youth Climate Report digital database, which is on the UNFCCC website. All the films, I'm happy to say, were approved without any changes, and they were added to the website. In November, this month, the films are presented as series of side events, press conferences, and pavilion exhibitions during the UN Annual Climate Summit, this year known as COP27, taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. So a little bit more on the Microfilm Festival. This is the program of events. We had an opening ceremony, and this was an Indigenous Chicana blessing. And I think I have a picture of it I'll show you in a little bit, but it was very, very interesting because it took, it's a matriarchal sort of society in this Chicana ceremony. So they had a priestess come in, and she laid out a bunch of fruit in front of her into the four corners, which represent north, south, east, and west. And at the center of that is what they refer to as Pachamama, which translates in English as Mother Nature. So they see nature at the core of all existence and all life, not just the environment. And then after that, we had the university's dance group performing a number called Re-Energizing. So these were Indigenous dancers that are enrolled at the university, and they got to put on a particular show, kind of like hula dancing, where their movements tell a story. And the idea of the story that they created was the re-energizing of the indigenous communities of Ecuador through these films. And then welcome messages from myself, Arari Ruiz, Sandra Sanchez, who's a professor at EPN, and the president of the university, known as a rector, Florena Munoz. Then we had the actual film presentations. Screening of the environmental documentary short, Runa Dwellers of the Mountain, came just before we showed all the student films. This was made by an indigenous professional filmmaker, Apak, sorry, I had trouble with that name. Yeah. Apak Perugachi. He was a local professional, independent environmental documentary filmmaker. So we thought it would be fun to see one of his short films before we saw the student films. Then we saw the Planetary Health Film Lab films, presenting all 16 of them with their filmmakers. Then we handed out the certificates, which they were very happy to get. And the attendance, we had 150 people in person, and virtually another 530 attended through the live Facebook broadcasts, which, by the way, is a wonderful way to do things. If you ever are having an event and you want to have a lot of people attend, rather than set up the relatively complicated Zoom platform, you can just set it up on Facebook Zoom and share the link. People click on the link and they see a live broadcast as it happens. So we found there was quite a few people that wanted to see this that couldn't make it in person. So we had 530 attend virtually through Facebook and 150 in person. So these are just some pictures of the filmmakers. I wanted you to see what some of them look like. And this is part of the films that they were doing when they were experimenting with the equipment, doing their selfies. So you notice they all have different kinds of cameras. Again, we didn't want to restrict them by forcing a certain technology on them. We wanted them to experiment with the various technologies that we made available to them, and the ones that were comfortable would use whatever they wanted to. And that included drone photography too. And a couple of them got used to that very fast too. So some of the cultural ceremonies, when you work with Indigenous communities, often there's ceremonial activity that they want to include in the program that you're providing for them. So on day one, we had this kind of circle welcome. We're standing in front of a baby palm tree, and we're standing in a circle showing unity, but the symbolism of the baby tree shows that these filmmakers are at the infancy of the program. So they're not quite full-fledged, fully grown adult filmmakers just yet. They have a lot to learn, just like the plant itself has a lot of room to grow. So the circle ceremony. On day 5 of the workshop, we had a special meal that acknowledged that the films were finished. And whenever there's a huge accomplishment in the Quechua communities of Ecuador, you have this very special meal. And they serve it on a leaf, a palm leaf here, and all the various components, rice and beans and other things, or potatoes, are added to this. And they serve a alcoholic beverage made from corn. Yeah, and it's warm. And frankly, it does not taste very good, but it is fermented. So that was kind of a highlight for them. It's called aknanya, traditional meal of celebration. And then the film festival I was telling you about, that particular ceremony, you see on the ground there, these are all various flowers and fruits, and they all held candles that were lit at the 4 corners, the north, west, east, and south. And when they were finished with the ceremony, all the organizers handed out fruit to the members of the audience so that they could literally and figuratively be part of the celebration in the filmmakers that day. That's the blessing of the films. Okay, so what we set out to do when we started the Planetary Health Film Lab is to have some general themes. So we wanted to have some consistency because we go around the world and work with various young people, but we wanted to have some consistency among the themes of planetary health. So we have 3 of them in particular. And the first one is generally planetary health. Several films address the theme by depicting the land as being sick. And we've heard the word planetary health a lot during this conference, but they kind of nailed it on the head in defining it the way they see it. They like the term planetary health. They prefer it over climate change, which they don't quite understand, or global warming, which they see as a singular issue. But planetary health is a general description of their relationship with the planet. And so they often described it as being sick, and it was kind of their job to try to heal it. So it connects their relationship to the land as affecting their own health as well. So there are often stories where the potatoes weren't growing as big or as plentiful as they used to because there was a drought. And so the direct relation to their own health is they had less food to eat. So they would get sick, you see. So this was the interconnected relationship they saw between planetary health and human health. As I mentioned here, for example, droughts contribute to a lower yield of crops and therefore less food for the community. The next theme we have is global health and humanitarianism. So other films recognized how their stories could assist other Indigenous communities around the world, and they shared their experiences and solutions to improve the health conditions of other global communities. And this is where the medium of film really comes into play in a big way. When they record their stories and their storytelling methods and the visible evidence of things taking place in their communities, often with solutions that they are using to overcome these obstacles, right? They share that with other Indigenous communities who may not have considered the solutions that they came up with for similar problems. And this form of knowledge mobilization really helps all the Indigenous communities, not just in South America, but around the world. And the final theme we like to work with is called global health foresighting. So some films identify the causes of planetary health issues in their communities, pointing the finger at capitalistic interests. In nearby mining projects, that's a theme that came up a couple of times in some of the films. Local youth can be seen here mobilizing and planning to defend their land against these projects, and by example, encouraging other communities to do the same. So they're looking towards the future. They see that mining projects and other capitalistic ventures are not good for the planet and not good for their communities and not good for them. And so they're trying to block this, and in the old-fashioned way, right? Like having sit-ins and linking arms and preventing the trucks from moving forward and things like that. And by making films about their activities and sharing them with other communities, they're sharing a certain methodology to stop this capitalistic invasion. So some of the logistics, how do we pull this off? Well, we were very, very fortunate to have certain very active and resourceful partners in Quito, Ecuador. And they were able to provide ground transportation, meals, and accommodations at a greatly reduced rate and at times at no cost at all. So the hotels, for example, were only $7 a night, and that included breakfast. So, and these were very, very nice, beautiful, comfortable hotels. If you were to stay in one of these, you would think that you found a boutique hotel that you would be writing home about. They're very, I got some pictures to show you too. So this hotel, for example, again, Chicana Hotel, that word is coming up again, right? This is the Four Corners ceremony. So this whole hotel is designed that way. They have 4 wings all pointing in the 4 directions, right? And they have murals on the wall painted by Indigenous artists on the outside and on the roof. They even grow corn on the roof. And they have gardens up there, and it's quite a spectacular place. They provided accommodation for all 16 participants and 2 organizers. So we had one organizer who was local, and we had another organizer who actually applied for the program but was too old. So he volunteered to kind of be the coordinator of the students. So he made sure they were always at home at a decent time, that they didn't work too late. He was kind of like the den mother, right? So it was very important to have someone like that there. And it was, as I mentioned before, only $7 US per room per night, including breakfast. Now, Chicana, as I mentioned before, is a Quechua word that represents their belief that all 4 points of the Andean cross are connected at the core to Pachamama, or Mother Nature. The meals. In addition to the breakfast provided each morning at Chicana, lunches for all participants, speakers, and organizers, I got in on this, right, were provided free of charge by the neighboring university, Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador. Right, so a good old example of Christian charity came to play, and they fed all of us. And it was an excellent meal. It was a 5-course meal every day at lunchtime. Equipment and facilities. All camera equipment, including drones, classrooms, computers, and post-production facilities and software were provided by EPN at no cost. And that included little pass cards, so if they wanted to get in late at night, they could buzz themselves in. And I'm very, very impressed with the equipment and software, because there was nothing I could imagine that we might have needed that wasn't provided. They absolutely thought of everything. Very, very sophisticated professional equipment, not just prosumer stuff, but things that you would use professionally. So here's some pictures of the accommodations. So you see, here's a typical bed with a pillow and these nice wooden carvings on the wall. These aren't just paintings, right? And then this was in the main lobby where they all got together to watch the soccer game on TV at night when they were unwinding. And this is the rooftop deck I was telling you about. You see the mountains in the background here and the city creeping up the mountains. This is from the rooftop, and they often just hung out here to chat about the day. And they had a little desk to work with. They had Wi-Fi as well, so they could actually work and share files when they were home at night. And here's just a panorama view of the city that you had from that rooftop deck I mentioned. So you see, it was very nice accommodations for $7 a night. And the facilities and equipment, these are just some more pictures to give you an idea of what they had to work with. This was our post-production studio. You see all these $10,000 IMAX lined up for them, right? And this was interesting too. When one filmmaker was struggling and was falling behind the pace of the others, the ones that were ahead would go and help them. It was just a very natural thing for them to do. They didn't have this idea of, you know, every man for himself sort of thing. They really had this communal sense, even though they were from different communities and at times couldn't even speak the language of each other. They would still come over like this. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. They would still come over and help each other finish their projects. And again, this is just another shot of all the computers in our lab there. And they got a little playful down here too. They were actually having fun doing this. It wasn't all work. And this is a typical lunch that we had. And this was the president of the Catholic University who provided these meals for us. Now, as I mentioned with the talks that we began the days with, where we covered a lot of different subjects related to planetary health, film making, the United Nations, youth empowerment, all that sort of thing. We also wanted to expand their experience in other educational areas that they might not have had exposure to. So because they were in the big city of Quito, we were able to do things like going to the Natural Museum of History, and they got to see animatronic dinosaurs that tried to bite them. So this was a fun experience for them. We also brought them to the Geoseismic Center of Ecuador. This is the place where all earthquake measurements are made for the entire country, so they got to see how that worked. And then we also brought them to the National Art Gallery featuring Indigenous art. So they got to see the kind of art that their own people are making, and this really inspired them too. You could see after they went to this gallery how certain artistic impressions and interpretations were being made with their own film. They started to play around with CGI and other effects to make their work more artsy. Okay, so all 4 days of the workshop that I described to you, we recorded them all. And I really encourage you to take a snapshot of the 4 days here and their respective earls, and then go back and play them. Because you can hear all the speeches, you can hear all the questions that are asked among the filmmakers, and you really get a good idea of how the program runs by looking at that. Yeah. Take your time. Did everybody get that? Yeah? Okay. And again, that's just a picture of us on the last day. That big thing behind us are just block letters saying EPN, the university's logo. So, what did the participants actually learn from this experience? Well, quite a few things, as it turned out. They learned how to use camera equipment, editing software, and Mac computers. Remember, none of them had experience with this stuff before. They learned how to make a documentary film and how to tell a story in this medium. They also learned about planetary health issues and solutions in their own and other Indigenous communities. They learned about youth and Indigenous engagement with the United Nations. They learned about plant-based medicines and other uses from North American Indigenous cultures. They learned about youth empowerment using film as a communications tool to speak to power, right? Instead of them just saying something or protesting with a sign or sending an email that doesn't get read, they found that film is a much more powerful communications tool in getting their point across to those in power. They learned about decolonizing planetary health and environmental law and Indigenous rights. This came from the Spanish sessions on days 3 and 4. They also learned about environmental issues in Indigenous territories, environmental politics, and the influence of art in politics. That came up quite a few times in some of the presentations that were made. And the economic impacts of planetary health issues. How does this affect economies around the world, right? Environmental history in Ecuador. They found this to be really fascinating because they had their own stories handed down by their respective elders, but to hear more statistical and data-driven historical accounts of what happened to the environment, like from the Geoseismic Center, it gave them what one described as a very high view of the entire country. I think we would say a 10,000-foot view or bird's eye view, so I thought that was interesting. And they learned about Ecuador's natural history and the geoseismic monitoring to detect volcanic activities and earthquakes. They found this fascinating as well. So we opened their eyes to a lot of new things. And of course, Indigenous art in Ecuador, outside of their own art. And we learned stuff too. So what did the organizers learn? Well, we learned quite a few things. We learned that the consistent theme that emerged in all these films was that the planet is sick. That was the word they liked to use. And it was poisoned by capitalistic interests in nearby mining projects and deforestation of the Amazon jungle. They saw this as the poison that was making the planet sick. This illness is represented by unsafe drinking water, reduced amounts of water in local rivers, and poor crop production with smaller and less produce. See? That's the symptoms of the illness. We also learned that WhatsApp is a powerful and easy-to-use tool preferred by participants for instant communications with each other. This was real. I know everybody's kind of used to it, but to have it used in this way was very efficient. Separate group accounts were set up for participant, organizers, and both. So video samples and rough cuts, for example, were shared through the social media quickly and easily. So if they wanted to talk to each other and say, does anybody know how to do a tail credit or whatever, they could do that and just talk amongst themselves. And it was a quick way of sending out a message to everybody at the same time. And when they wanted to talk to us, they would say, I'm almost finished, but I need another hour. Is that okay? And then we had instant communication with the organizers. And then when it was more of a collective thing, like the film festival is going to begin at 9 o'clock tomorrow, does everybody got that? And then all of us, organizers and participants, would get the message instantly. So we found it to be a fantastic way because we couldn't be together all the time. But we needed to talk all the time. So this was a very good social media tool for that purpose. And we also learned that partner universities bring a wealth of resources, both material and human, to the Planetary Health Film Lab, not just financial. Right? We always think of partners bringing in money to the project, but these things cost money, and they were provided, so it's just as good as money, right? Contributions in kind were significant, with access to post-production labs and filmmaking equipment, free lunches every day for the participants and organizers, substantial discounts on accommodation through the university's established hotel connections. And this is true, I would imagine, everywhere in the world. If you find a university, they usually have some kind of connection with a local hotel, probably something on campus. So these sorts of relationships are not only important, but they're kind of essential to take on a long-term project like this. So the results. The number of participants at the beginning of the program were 16. Number of participants that completed the program were 16. Number of films produced, 16. Number of certificates of completion issued, 16. Number of entrance surveys completed. This is important, that's 16, because there's often a challenge in getting them to fill out a boring questionnaire, asking all these questions about what do you expect to get out of this program and things like that. But they all did it, so I'm proud of that. Same with the exit surveys. This is when the program is over. We give them a questionnaire on how did they enjoy the experience? What did they get out of it? Were their expectations met? That sort of thing. And all of them did that as well. Attendance at all workshop presentations were 100%, but I should explain that. 15 were in person, and one poor guy was trapped on the Galapagos Islands. He couldn't get off, but he did attend virtually. He was our only Zoom guy. But he did participate, even though he couldn't be there in person. Languages of finished films, 4. We had Quechua, Shuar, Spanish, and English. Now, what I should say about his final film, the poor guy that was trapped on the Galapagos Islands, we were just about to take all the films down to the theater for the big premiere. And we had 15 of them, and we were just walking out the door when he came running in. And he had a USB in his hand. He was holding it up. He said, here's my film, here's my film. And I said, who are you? Because I didn't recognize him. I never saw him in person before. He said, well, you saw me on Zoom, right? I went, oh my God, we didn't think you would actually finish a film, because he didn't have any of the same facilities and equipment available to him that the others had, but he still did it. And so we were able to add it at the last second. So that made it 100%. So the preliminary analysis before we break down the surveys is engaging with each other in person rather than Zoom exclusively yielded a high rate of participation and collaboration among participants and allowed for ancillary educational opportunities such as visits to planetary health related places like natural history museums and environmental monitoring stations. So a detailed analysis is still to come following a review of the entrance and exit surveys. So more to come. Stay tuned. Okay, now this is very interesting. This is the communications department of EPN University, one of our partners there. They put together this little promotional video explaining their participation in the program and the Planetary Health Film Lab in general. Okay, now it's in Spanish, except for the part where I speak, but I hope you can enjoy this.
La Escuela Politécnica Nacional fue sede del taller y del Festival de Laboratorio de Cine sobre Salud Planetaria.
The Planetary Health Film Lab is a research project that comes out of York University. There's a very specific institute at the university called the Dodley Institute for Global Health Research, and the idea of the Planetary Health Film Lab is to train young people in indigenous communities and remote communities throughout the world how to make short documentary films to inform and influence the policymakers of the United Nations.
Los organizadores del laboratorio fueron la Escuela Politécnica Nacional, la Universidad York de Canadá y la Academia Quechua de Humanidades, que contaron con el apoyo de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador.
Chaymantami, ñukanchik ñawpa runakuna ashtawan hatarishpa katina kanchik, shinallataq ñukanchipa yachaykunata shuk llaqtakunaman apashpa, katishpa, purishpa katina kanchik. Ñukanchik tukurikpi, ñukanchik mana hatarikpi, ñukanchik mana rimaqpi, kay tiksimuyu tukuringa.
16 jóvenes indígenas de Ecuador fueron seleccionados para participar en este laboratorio. Ellos tuvieron 90 días para realizar la preproducción, el rodaje y la postproducción de sus trabajos.
Y estas producciones tienen la finalidad de llegar hacia los tomadores de decisiones en la COP27, la Conferencia de Cambio Climático, que en este año será en Egipto.
Los films tratan sobre ambiente, salud humana, cambio climático, seguridad del agua, seguridad alimentaria, entre otros.
El lunes pasado, mientras inaugurábamos esta jornada, recordábamos las potentes figuras y el papel que desempeñaron Tránsito Amaguaña, Dolores Cacuango, Nela Martínez, mujeres que gestaron cambios a través de su accionar en la representación de sus comunidades. Hoy tenemos la oportunidad de presentar las necesidades de la comunidad indígena como lo hicieron estas mujeres, pero con recursos de un alcance universal.
Los cortometrajes estrenados en la Escuela Politécnica Nacional se publicarán en los sitios web de la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas sobre el Cambio Climático, del Instituto Dadalé y en el Informe sobre el Clima de la Juventud. También serán presentados en la Cumbre Climática de las Naciones Unidas que se llevará a cabo en Egipto en noviembre de este año.
So you can see how proud they were of this particular program. And something I learned well after the fact was that this was the very first time they had a program specifically for Indigenous youth. There are Indigenous students that attend the university, but they never had a program specifically for Indigenous communities. So this was kind of a pilot project for them to see how it would work. And they were very, very happy to see how it all came together and how successful the results were with the participating students. So I think it will spark them to do their own projects going forward. Right? So where to see these films? I'm sure you're all dying of curiosity and you want to see these films, right? Well, here you go. All 16 films with Spanish and English subtitles have been uploaded to the Youth Climate Report's YouTube channel. They're all on the Youth Climate Report GIS database, but if you don't want to go around and try to find them all that way, you can find them much easier on the playlist provided on YCR's YouTube channel. So these films have been approved by the UNFCCC and updated to the GIS database, and if you want to go there, there's the link for it. Okay, so if you want to grab a picture of that, it's basically tinyurl.com/YCR-UNFCCC-map. The films can also be seen here. These are the ones with Spanish subtitles. And this URL will bring you to the ones with English subtitles. Okay, and then down here at the bottom, you can see the list of all the various collaborators and sponsors of the Planetary Health Film Lab. We got the UNFCCC here first, the Youth Climate Report, York University, the Dodley Institute of Global Health Research, the Young Lives Research Lab, and UNESCO, the Chair for Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability, and finally, of course, the whole reason we're here is the Planetary Health Alliance. Okay, everybody got that? Yeah. So going forward, what's going to happen with these films now that they're finished? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, we're going to be showing them at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. A brand new pavilion for youth is being introduced this year. There was always a lot of complaints among young people that The UN often said they want to be very inclusive and invite all these different communities, indigenous people and women, and they said, what about us? How come we can't go inside the convention center? This complaint came up year after year, and so this year they addressed it by creating a pavilion just for youth in the blue zone. And if you don't know what that means, the blue zone is the important zone where all the policy meetings take place and all the negotiation sessions take place. The green zone, by contrast, is for NGOs to hand out their material and information, and it's kind of open to the public. But the other one is more of a serious area where it's restricted to world leaders and policymakers. So that's where the new youth pavilion is. And on November the 11th, at 4:45 p.m. Egypt time, we are going to show all the films at this new pavilion. And we're also going to have a press conference that's going to take place, and we're going to show one of the films as a teaser, but we're also going to be promoting the actual event at the Youth Pavilion and more information about the program. And that's going to take place on November the 7th at 10:30 a.m. Egypt time. I don't know if anybody's planning to go to COP, but write down those dates and times and I'll see you there, right? And then, of course, what we're doing right now. Here we are. This is a side event presenting the films, and this is basically what I'm doing, standing up here talking about this. So we're lucky enough to have Kate Tilichek, as I mentioned here before, too. So if you have any questions of either of us about this program, we're here. And finally, this is very exciting, I think. Sometime later this month, the Lancet is celebrating its 200th anniversary. And they've been they're going to be producing 7 videos of key stories that they've covered throughout these 200 years. And one of the stories is going to be about the Planetary Health Film Lab. And I've been asked to help produce this video with their editor, Rose Worrell. So that'll be very interesting. So. Okay, you probably wanted to see one of these films. You've heard enough of me talking about them. You probably want to see one of them, right? So I got this excellent selection by a student named Rimac Santillan. So I'll just play it. There's English subtitles too. Pay attention to the beauty of the footage that he captured. First time filmmaker. All the music is original as well and indigenously created.
Causa de primera vez para hace 30 años cuenta que chaypica kushnika tutandi punjandi nina kushnika na joshi hopi impactante karian amma chay mapa mundo narikta rico y ñuka paka yaki pacha karian Europa de kaspaka. Kunang kay pachapi kausaypi kay momento kausaypi ka kay tarpuy kunapi ka ongoy alita pacha yakichinacho, por ejemplo pundaka tauka variedad papa kunata charin kariachi y kay ñukanchi llaqtapi nishu kay agato urko kunapi pas papataka tarpu karianchi fokuchin karianchi, pero kunambika nya papataka nya natarpi ushan kay fábrica kuna factoría chay sisata tarpu chay yaki mapa chay contaminación chay químico kuna tukuy laduma afectan kankashka soberanía alimentaria nishkapaka kay lancha ungoymi ninan hatu ungoy kan.
Le sueltan polvo y el polvo se va todito al tanque de agua y está contaminado eso.
qué podemos hacer. La manera más eficiente y barata de poder mitigar gases de efecto invernadero alrededor del mundo es plantando árboles. Y eso es lo que hacemos.
Yukanchi alpa mamama mangakutin paipa kushihuyman paipa yachayman paipa karayman tigraspa y chay tigraypika rikuspa yakutin randi ñukanchipas payman tigrachinata yanakanchi karaykunawan kushi tarpuykunawan punta natiaskamuyukunata piña chichispa kirukunata tarpuspa kutin ñukanchipak alpa mama chay huyayman tigranata yanakanchik.
I thought that was a very interesting credit roll, eh? Yeah. So there you go. And just on a side note here, I talk more about the Planetary Health Film Lab in a new book that was just released last week. It's called The Emerging Role of Geomedia in Environmental Humanities. And this showcases how the films made in the Planetary Health Film Lab are geolocated on a GIS map, making it easy for the policymaker to see these films created by Indigenous youth from around the world in all one digital space. So if you want to find out more about that, I have a few advanced copies with me if anybody is interested. So I do have a few copies of the book now, or you can just order it on Amazon, but it costs way too much. So, and there we go. That's it. So I hope you enjoyed that presentation on the Planetary Health Film Lab in our program. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thanks. Sure, Kate, yeah.
Thanks, Mark, so much. It's great to sit back here and watch it. Oh, yes. Thanks, Mark, so much. It's great to sit back here and watch it all be told as a large story and come together. I'm just wondering a little bit about the process of the films being, I think you said they pass by or they're approved at the UN level. And, you know, what are they looking for? And is it something that you can help the filmmakers understand the way in which they'll be evaluated so that they will pass into the Youth Climate Report? If you can just say a little bit more about that.
Okay, sure. Great question. Thank you, Kate. Yes, the UN has a certain standard of film. Film being used as a data delivery system by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is relatively new, going back to 2009. And what they don't want to see are any kind of incendiary messages and rallying and criticism of governments or companies. What they want to see is information that can help the policymakers. So it's basically data, statistics, research that's done that way. And that's why they have a very specific structure where they want to see in Indigenous films an interview with an elder, an interview with a community member who's impacted by climate change or environmental issues or planetary health issues. And thirdly, who's the third person? Oh, who was it? Sorry? Yes, that's right. Yeah, and whenever possible, have an expert or a researcher or a scientist be interviewed to provide some kind of expert context on the issues being profiled. Thank you, Gigi. Yeah, so once they have those key components added to their film. There are certain stylistic structures they like to see so that all the films presented at these COP conferences are relatively uniformed. So they want to see the interview subject's head from the chest up on one side of the frame. It doesn't matter which side, but one side of the frame. And on the empty side of the frame is their ID tag, also known as a lower third, that has their name and then their title underneath. Okay, so again, that's just a stylistic structure. And in the credits, of course, they want to see who's involved with the film, not just the individuals that made it, but the other organizations that help support it. Okay. Yeah, come on up.
I'm sure you can hear me from across the room, but you know.
Oh, it's for the recording, yeah.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for this. This has been really, really interesting, and especially coming from Malaysia, you know, we have pockets of indigenous communities of our own, and seeing that there's a lot of youth leadership who want to communicate the knowledge coming from these communities. So this is a good blend of, you know, youth leadership as well as using different communication tools. So I'm curious, when it comes to the interviews of the participants with elders in the communities, was there any format at all to the surveys, you know, as in, are the questions predetermined, or, you know, if there's even any format at all? But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, well, we encourage the filmmakers to be artists and to be filmmakers and to ask whatever questions they want. We don't want to restrict that at all, but we do insist that they ask certain questions, like historically, like this is of the elders, right? Historically, what did our environment look like in the days before we were born? So that helps provide a context of change, and we can see what happened from their days to our days. And so that kind of question is very important to hear what the elders have to say about that. And the same with the impact on people that live within the community. How were they impacted? We need to know that. Did their house collapse? Are they eating 50% less food? You know, these sorts of things. So it's important to know what kind of impact the planetary health issues are having on individuals in the community. And then of course, the experts, we want to address the issues being mentioned in the film from the experts. Like, why is this happening? Usually they have already done some research and they have some statistics available for them that provide some kind of scientific context to understanding what's happening in these communities. Now, I'd like to tell you a little story. I know nobody's asked this question, but how are these films used at the COP conferences, right? Well, a lot of policymakers will bring their laptop in and call up the map on their computer while they're listening to a negotiation session. So whatever the subject that's being discussed, they can do a search on the GIS map of that subject, and then all the videos that relate to that subject will come up and the others will disappear. So now they've got a good kind of global perspective of that particular issue. And if they want to focus on how it impacts on their own country that they're representing, they can do that. Or if they want to compare the videos to other countries that are either nearby or far away, because spatial and temporal analysis becomes very important in looking at these films. Because each film individually tells an explicit narrative of a certain story. But when you compare the videos with each other, implicit narratives emerge. New stories come up, new data emerges that wasn't in either film individually, right? But comparatively, you find out new things. So they use that as literally a data delivery system while they're engaged with this process. And I saw a wonderful example of one video influencing the policy of another country. This was in Mexico. A video was submitted where a young boy was walking to school every day and he passed this giant garbage dump filled with rubber tires, and he didn't like to see that and he wanted to do something about it. And he saw a video online where there's these machines that crush and pulverize anything that you put in it. You might have seen these videos, right, where they throw chairs and lawnmowers in this thing and it just crushes it. So he took these tires to one such place, and they pulverized the rubber into like a little mulch, almost like sand, right? And then he got a mold of a brick, and he put all the little bits of rubber in this mold and then put it in a kiln and heated it up so it all melted together. And then he would let it cool, take it out, and he had a rubber brick. And he eventually did this enough with all this spare tires to build homes for the homeless. So this was his little project he did over several years. And when that film premiered, I believe it was, where was it before Madrid? In COP24. Sorry, I forget what that was. But anyways, one of the delegates from Kenya saw this video and said, we can do that where we live too. So there's a very good example of how these individual films made by young people can inspire policy in other countries around the world.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate Dr. Telly, your contribution, and this is fascinating. And because I still kind of new to this project and also the Plant Health Alliance in general, so I'm kind of curious about, especially, I mean, talk about you as a researcher and also the advocate of a PHA. So how and why? What motivated you to initiate and proceed with this project? Mm-hmm. And I also want to know, especially, what is the future, or from your perspective, what this will contribute in general to the plant health movement?
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. Well, in my course of study as an academic, I found that I was very drawn to underrepresented communities because many things take place, not just at the United Nations, but on a national level too, where policies are created without addressing everyone who should be included. We always talk about inclusivity and trying to involve everybody in the decision-making process when it comes to policy, but sometimes communities are left out, not because they're intentionally ignored, but because they are so remote, it's difficult to get communication from them. It's expensive to visit them. They're so far away, it takes a long time to get there. And so just by the nature of logistics, it becomes, they become excluded. And so I wanted to find a way to correct that. And one of the early papers I read in my studies was a research paper by George Ferreira of the University of Guelph. And he did this experiment by giving remote communities very, very far up north in the Arctic cameras to tell their stories. And then once he didn't tell them how to do it or anything, right? But they would show things on these videos, and he would take the videos back and bring it to the national government and show the people there, and they would, wow, we had no idea there were all these problems. And then they put policies in place that would resolve these problems. So it was because of film where they were able to see the visible evidence of a certain issue that influenced the policymakers to come up with solutions. Emails don't do that, phone calls don't do that, letter writing doesn't do that, but film does. And so I was quite inspired by that research. So I wanted to follow through with that. And because of my own connection with the United Nations in 2009, 2010 with environmental documentary features, I was given the opportunity to develop a program in 2011. And my only kind of guidance from the UN was involve youth somehow. And so I said, okay, I think I know what to do. So I reached out to young people in very remote communities. And I said, just do a short little film about what's happening to you in terms of climate change and send it to us. And so I would get about, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 a year. And I would stitch them together in the form of a 1-hour documentary, compilation film. And then I would show that at the COP conferences. I did that from 2011 to 2015. And that worked well. It satisfied what they wanted, but there was still a problem about that. First of all, it was still underrepresented. We only had 5 to 8 films. Secondly, showing them as a single film was a bit of a scheduling problem at the COP conferences, because everybody has a million things to do and to meetings to go to and everything. So it was very hard to set a date and a time where a large number of people could attend. And so in 2015, I was introduced to geomedia and GIS technology because Google was putting out an experimental format called Fusion Tables. It's no longer in existence. It's now morphed into something called Google My Maps, but originally Fusion Tables provided the affordance of video for the first time. And so we were able to incorporate video into the pins on these maps and geolocate them based on where the stories in the films take place, right? And then we were able to add all kinds of metadata, including links to websites, uploads of scientific papers, all related to the themes and subject matter of these individual films. And now we had one digital space that anybody could access at any time, even during policy meetings. And they could watch it at home, wherever they wanted to do it, back at the hotel, or during meetings at the actual COP conference. And that checked off a lot of boxes for the UN, because now they could get many more videos, they could have better representation, and they could watch it whenever they wanted to. So that became the Youth Climate Report as we know it today. And we started with 141 videos in 2015 at the Paris Climate Summit. When the UN sanctioned it the next year in Morocco, we got another 80. And to this day, 5 years later, is that 5 years? No, 7 years later, we have 675 videos. And I'm proud to say on all 7 continents. You should see the ones from Antarctica made by the students there. These are research assistants, right, working with the British Antarctic Survey, and they do fascinating films there. So it's really good to juxtapose the video research being done in Antarctica with that being done in the Arctic. With glacier collapse and everything, seeing the similarities and the differences is very interesting. I know I didn't answer anybody's question, but I just wanted to share that with you. Okay. Anything else? No, I think we're done. As we like to say, that's a wrap, eh? So thank you, everybody. Thank you.